Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today I am welcoming Craig Greenfield to the show. Craig is the founder and director of Alongsiders International, a grassroots movement of young Christians reaching the world's poorest children. Originally from New Zealand, he has lived and worked for more than 2 decades in marginalized communities in Asia and North America. He is the author of The Urban Halo and Subversive Jesus. Let's welcome Craig to the show. All right, welcome to the show. Today I'm joined by Craig Greenfield. So thanks for being here, Craig. Anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Thanks, Lauren. It's great to be with you. As you can probably tell from my accent, I was not born in the United States. I was actually born in Canada to immigrant parents, but grew up in New Zealand. So that explains my accent.
Great. And Craig is actually joining me in this conversation from about the farthest distanced interview I probably recorded to this point in Cambodia at, as I understand, 9 p.m. local time.
That's right.
So if we have some background distractions, this is part of the deal.
That's right. Roosters or people driving past selling food, you might hear some background noises.
Yeah. Well, share if you would, Craig, kind of about your journey of faith, what that looked like initially and what that looks like today.
Sure. Well, I grew up in New Zealand, as I said, and I grew up actually in the church. My parents were missionaries. My grandparents were missionaries, so it goes way back. But I grew up with and probably like a lot of folks, a very personalized, kind of individualized faith. So very much about me and God, very much about that individual kind of Western perspective on faith. And it wasn't until moving to Cambodia that I realized that necessarily wasn't the worldview that everybody has, and is perhaps not even a very biblical worldview. And so it's been a long journey. First went to Cambodia 25 years ago. It's been a very long journey of kind of, unpacking some of my cultural baggage and coming to see the gospel in new ways through new eyes. And it's been a good one.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. What has been some spiritual practices that have been meaningful for you?
Well, I think part of that journey from that individualized faith into more of a communal faith has just been some of these communal practices. So actually, after 7 years of living in the slums in Cambodia, we actually moved to inner city Vancouver, Canada, and started a Christian community there that welcomed in those from the streets and struggling with addiction. And one of our practices was to have both morning kind of reflections and prayer, and then in the evening, coming together. Often it would actually be at 9 p.m. It would be at this time of night for me. And no matter who was there, we would kind of make the announcement. And there'd often be people there who were, homeless or whatever. We'd make the announcement, this is our kind of closing prayer time. And then we'd have a time of singing some teze. I don't know if you're familiar with teze, these kind of very repetitive scriptural one-line songs. And then the Ignatian Examen, which is just a way of reflecting on where was God's light during our day. And for me, kind of, there's times in our life when we're spiritually dry, or, it's ups and downs, at least for me it is. But those communal practices kind of create a structure and a rhythm to life that for me has been very life-giving. And I love it. I love that kind of having some framework or scaffolding around my faith that others carry me along when I'm not really feeling up to it myself.
Yeah, I'm hearing that more and more, I feel like, of course, anecdotally, but I feel like that's such a good point in, like you say, this individualized faith emphasis in Western cultures where, our spirituality and our feelings of closeness to God are so often dependent on our own efforts and
Yeah.
feelings, where
Yeah.
conversely, like you say, these rituals and practices and communal practices really kind of do the work for us or help us along the work. I don't know what words you'd want to use exactly, but really help sustain us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like I've seen a cartoon where you have a group of maybe 4 people and they have their arms around each other's shoulders. And there's times when, 1 or 2 of us is walking over a hole or something, but because we're all holding each other up, we get past it. We get past those stumbling blocks.
Yeah. That's good. Thanks for sharing that. Well, I had Craig on the show to talk about his book, Subversive Mission, Serving as Outsiders in a World of Need. And I should say, give a shout out here. Craig was introduced to me from Jason Porterfield, who I had on earlier. And Craig, glad it was great to connect with you and then check out your book. Really enjoyed reading it. Share, if you would, kind of what inspired the book and what brought it to be.
Yeah, well, as I said, I grew up with a very kind of individualized faith. But what I'm seeing about this generation is that this is a generation that's very much passionate about justice. And when we kind of reflect on the world, look at the ways that we have not always done things so well, look at reflect on colonialism in the past. We've all read When Helping Hurts. We all have a sense of how badly things can go. And that's good because we need those new perspectives. We need learning. But the reality is now that this is a generation that is paralyzed about what our role looks like in the world. We're paralyzed about what it looks like to serve in the world. And I do believe that God is still calling us to love our neighbors, whether they're across the street, across the border, or across the world. And that command, that invitation from Jesus has not changed. And so paralysis in the face of that, in the face of the struggles of our brothers and sisters around the world is I believe we're falling short of what Jesus wants for us. So how do we take on board all of the lessons and learning and the passion for justice, which I share, while not giving up on this sense of how do we love our neighbors?
How do you, if I can ask this, where do you see that paralysis, as you say, playing out? Like, and I'm curious because I've kind of, that resonates with me a little bit, where I'm wondering, like, in my mind, I see like spinning wheels, like a lot of energy and effort around obviously justice and equality, but sometimes we don't always see effective, impactful efforts. Is that track with what you're thinking?
Yeah, I mean, certainly critique is a big part of how our generation kind of views the world. And so, no one wants to be a white savior or a savior of any color. And so we'd rather do nothing than do anything or get it wrong. It's so interesting to me. I just because of the weird space that I inhabit, I'm often, speaking at a missions conference one weekend, and then the next weekend speaking at the Justice Conference. I've spoken at a couple of different justice conferences, and very, very different crowds, very, very different. Yeah. And yet 2 crowds that are both passionate about seeing God's shalom come in this world, and just using different language, using perhaps different approaches. But I don't think we're as far apart from each other as we might think. And when I meet with leaders of missions agencies or missions committees, I encourage them to honestly to ditch the word missions, to ditch the word missionary. I think for this generation, those terms hold far too much baggage. Yeah, you're going to have a fight on your hands with the older generation for sure. Right. But for this generation, I think those words have kind of passed their use by date, to be honest.
Yeah, this was a question I was thinking about. Is the word missionary and is the practice of missions, broadly speaking, at least 20th century missions? I mean, there's some I read who've said or suggested that the whole endeavor itself is just entrenched in colonialism. Do you think there's a way to this is a big question, perhaps, is the whole endeavor salvageable, I guess, apart from colonialism?
Look, I would say yes. Many would say no. I would say yes with huge caveats. And this is really why I wrote this book, because, if I could just, trace this back to the birth of Jesus under the census. So Jesus was born in the shadow of empire, right? And the census is taking place. Empires hold a census because they want to know how much taxes they can collect and how many soldiers they can co-opt. So it's about money and power. Taxes, money, power, soldiers. So Jesus is born in the shadow of these twin pillars of money and power. And yet Jesus brings the very opposite of that with his upside-down kingdom, very opposite approach. And in fact, in Luke 3, John the Baptist calls two specific groups to repentance, the tax collectors and the soldiers. And so Jesus' whole ministry is about rejecting the use of money and power. Now, where throughout history we have gone wrong, it's usually tied up with these two things, the way that we use money and power. And that's at the heart of why colonialism is a big part of why colonialism is so wrong and so off track, is because of the ways that money and power are used. And so when we reflect on missions and look at how money and power are used very much in the same ways often, that's where we've also gone wrong. And so I believe that if we can strip away and critique our practices through those lenses and put on in its place this upside-down Jesus lens. And I actually use the framework in Ephesians 4, the fivefold ministry, to look at each of those in the light of what it could look like going forward. And this book is really a framework of how we can serve in the world as outsiders, a world that is still, very much in need, that we need to be in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, but without carrying these twin things of empire in our hands, of money and power. And that's the challenge for us as Westerners, because we're very often blind to our own. Some people use the word privilege. Some people don't like that word, but it's literally just we're blind to our own money and power and the dangers of those in the world.
Yeah. Thanks for engaging that with me. You mentioned the five types from Ephesians, which you highlight is a big part of your book here. So let's talk through those if we can.
Sure.
The first one is apostle, and you suggest a reframing from apostle to catalyst. So why don't we kind of just talk through each of those, if you don't mind?
Yeah. So what I want to suggest is that we are just very honest about the fact that we are outsiders. We're never going to be insiders. I've lived here in Cambodia for many, many years. I've just done another stint of 9 years. I speak the language fluently. I understand the culture quite well. I'm married to a Cambodian. I'll never be an insider. And so the roles, the biblical roles that are outlined in Ephesians 4, I believe are roles for insiders. So maybe in my context, whether it's New Zealand or Canada, I'm apostolic. I have that pioneering, instigating, entrepreneurial gifting. Well, when I get on that plane and come to Cambodia or India or Kenya or some other place where I'm an outsider, or even maybe just domestically going to another place where I'm a cultural outsider. What I want to suggest is that we take off that cap that goes with being an insider as a catalyst, as an apostle, and put on the cap of a catalyst who comes alongside local people and helps them to give birth to the vision that God has placed in their hearts as local apostolically gifted, because they're the ones who need to carry this forward. They're the ones who need to have this sense of ownership and responsibility to nurture this new vision that God is laying on their hearts. That's whether you're planning a church or planning a new initiative. If local people don't own that from the very beginning, then you're going to have a real tough time getting that sense of ownership when you want to have time to pass it over.
Yeah. And that's certainly again, from my perspective, at least, the model of missions that we've seen is that of the apostle, coming in with solutions and answers, and driving. Let's talk about the next one here, from prophet to ally.
Yeah. This one resonates with me. As I said, I'm passionate about issues of justice. I believe that we do need, gifted, God-anointed people to speak truth to power. Now, when I come to Cambodia, and as I mentioned earlier, I've lived in the slums and urban poor communities for many years. And in fact, my family and I have been evicted from 2 different slums along with our neighbors. Just frankly, that impacts me and my family very differently to the way it impacts my neighbors. Yeah, it's devastating for me, but it's even more devastating and, life-threatening for my neighbors. And I remember after we were evicted from our second slum, one of the young Cambodian women who was being evicted, she took 4 of her friends down. They dragged their bamboo beds down to the middle of the busiest intersection in Cambodia. Just crying out, saying, "We have nowhere to lay our heads, so we'll lay them right here, and you can deal with us because you've taken our homes." So just an absolute act of both desperation and courage. And you can just imagine the dust flying, the horns honking, and then the boots of the soldiers as they run towards these women and drag them into a van and take them off and arrest them. Well, see, if you reflect on that, her role was to speak out prophetically against the injustice that was being foisted upon her. My role is not to necessarily lead the protest march or to put my bed in the middle of the intersection. Usually my role as an ally is going to be, how do I amplify her voice? How do I amplify her story beyond the circles of influence that she has, which are, she doesn't speak English, so it's only Cambodians. Whereas I have this much wider network. And so as an ally, I can amplify her voice. And I can only do that because I'm living in connection and in solidarity with her. And I see the issues that she's struggling with, and to some extent have some experience of them myself. So that's a little bit of a difference. It's just a difference in posture, isn't it? The prophet needs to be at the center. The allies come from the side. We're not the superheroes, we're the sidekicks.
Yeah. Let me ask this follow-up question, if I may. I think a challenge or a critique perhaps might be that I've heard is, the ally, to use that frame, kind of, what's the word, taking the voice of, or, how do you do it so that when you're amplifying their voice, not your voice, and you're not kind of stealing their story, so to speak? Yeah,
for sure. And it's a tough line to walk. But what I would suggest is if we are amplifying their voice, then there's a sense in which we are helping people to see both the tragedy and the resilience of their situation. So both the good news and the bad news. So the sense that, wow, it's tragic what's happening to her. It's tragic that she's being, But if we leave it at that, it's just kind of like, oh, what a pathetic victim she is. But if we pair that with her resilience and her strength and her courage, and we amplify that and put a spotlight on that, we're not on our own, not on anything I'm doing, but on what she's doing, then we're also giving that balanced picture. And we often use that verse, speak up for the voiceless, from Proverbs. And I think we need to have that with a little bit of nuance, don't we? Because often it's not that they're voiceless, it's that they're deliberately silenced and ignored.
Right. Yeah. So the third type you have is evangelist to seeker.
Yeah, that one might just provoke a few
ruffle some
buttons.
feathers.
But let me explain, and I love this. I love the way that Paul enters into Athens. And one of his first acts, which I think is so just, provocative, was to go and examine all of their religious items and to go and be a learner in the sense of, he's checking out all the idols, and he is seeking to discover how God is already in conversation with these people. That's what I mean by seeker. Are we willing to listen first and ask God to open our eyes and seek to see what God is already saying in this context, in this culture, the ways that he's already revealed himself to these people? Don Richardson wrote a very famous book, Peace Child, where he uses the term redemptive analogies. And it doesn't have to be some kind of clever key that unlocks the entire culture for everybody. It may just be simply, within this religious ceremony, within this celebration, within this action that you all love, there are seeds of the divine. There are signs of the Spirit. And I say that equally for Western cultures as Eastern cultures and other cultures. God is always at work, often in ways that we don't have eyes to see.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that's something that's been impacting me of late, is just hearing, I imagine you may be familiar with, I think it's Richard Blackaby, who I think was worked in Canada for a time. I feel like his work, maybe through his son, is kind of coming back into prevalence. And that was a key question, where is God at work? How can I be a part of it? Yeah. That question has really been impacting me of late.
Well, it's so true, but we often say, I want to see God at work, but it can't be in any other religion or strange cultural expression. But in the book of James, it says every good thing comes from God. So where we see good, can we not also see God? Where Buddhists try to practice nonviolence, is that not a good thing? Can't we applaud the fact that they are embracing nonviolence? Now, maybe not in the ways and with the nuance that we understand that, but I think there's just a different posture, and this generation is not resonating with this kind of antagonistic, aggressive Christianity that seeks to go up against others and have a big fight. It's much more about listening to each other and saying, what's God already saying to you, and how can I be part of that conversation as well?
Craig, it makes me think, I don't know when you spent your time in Canada. I don't know if this part of 90s American conservative Christianity matriculated up to Canada. But I remember in my formative years, like, so much of the culture of conservative American Christian culture was this, like, let's go out and do battle and apologetics, and we're just gonna fight and win people over to Christ. Like, that's actually,
and all that language, right? It's so triumphalistic and conquering. And there's a sense in which we conquer in the spiritual realm, but a lot of it feels like conquering other cultures and people, which I don't think sits right with us these days.
Well, and perhaps we might say, to your point there, Craig, like, about Jesus and power, like the way that Jesus conquers power is not through power. I mean, at least my interpretation of the book, for example, of Revelation, is Jesus' victory is not through triumphalism and military defeat. It's through self-sacrifice and flipping expectations, so to speak. Well, the fourth model you have is pastor to midwife.
Sure. Yeah, and this is kind of the classic one, isn't it? The pastor from Seattle goes to Senegal to plant a church. But what I want to suggest is that on that plane, we take off the hat of a pastor and put on the hat of a midwife. One who helps others, local people, insiders, give birth to local communities of faith, whether it's the church or other expressions of the communities of faith. And the reason for that is, cultural understanding is so central to the way that churches need to be formed. And our mandate is not to go out and plant Hillsong churches all over Africa and Asia. I'm sorry to say that. It's just not. And I say that with a quasi-Australian accent. It is to help local people discover what church is going to look like in their context. I'll give you an example. Here in Cambodia, the first missionaries arrived and saw that Cambodians use incense to worship their ancestors and to worship spirits. And incense is just a central part of worship here. And so the first missionaries just banned it outright. So to this day, no Christians in Cambodia use incense. And their cultural the ways that the church has been planted here look very foreign to other Cambodians as a result. And that's really sad because, incense is used for worship all through the Bible. Why couldn't we redirect that worship? In contrast, in Mongolia, the missionaries arrived and saw that yak milk is a very sacred kind of item.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when they would give thanks for their meal, they would toss a cup of yak milk into the air to the gods as an act of worship. And those missionaries were a little bit more savvy, and they said, well, when you toss your yak milk into the air, why don't you toss it to Jesus, the one true God? And so as a result, there's much more local cultural expression of what it means to follow Jesus in Mongolia. And obviously I'm speaking in huge generalities, but to make the point that when we put local people and leaders and Christian leaders, and I'm very much talking about a world now where there are, even in Cambodia, which only has 1.7% Christians, I think, there's still thousands of Christians here.
Right.
And so, it lends itself to the idea that we don't need to come and kind of guess what local Christianity could look like. We can partner with local people and help them to give birth to the church.
Yeah. The model you talk about of the example of that milk tossing and the incense, it makes me think a lot about one of my questions here I'm going to ask you soon is about, church planting, even here in my neck of the woods in the States, and how much these, asking people to kind of completely adopt a new culture. Cause I wonder if part of the challenge, and maybe this is something you can speak to more directly and some implications, is going somewhere and asking people to essentially adapt an entirely new culture and leave a culture behind is a big ask, right?
Yeah, and not that we are not bringing a big ask to people. We're asking them to lay down their lives to follow Jesus.
Right.
But as one African said, when you brought the bread of life to Jesus, you brought it in a plastic bag and shoved the whole thing down our throats. And so what are we actually bringing? Are we bringing the call to follow Jesus, or are we calling bringing all of these cultural trappings of the church and the way that we think it should be done? Church has to be like this. Got to have a 30-minute sermon in the middle. Got to have 3 songs of worship. There's nothing like that. That's our cultural interpretation of what church should look like. I'll give you another example, the way that we in church, we pass around, the offering bag. And it's very clear what goes in the offering bag, right? It's meant to be money. If you come along with a chicken and stick a chicken in the offering bag, you're going to have people looking at you funny. And so, missionaries planting churches in other parts of the world, they have an offering bag or a plate where you put money, and it's very clear what's supposed to go there. And yet many of these economies are not actually, always based on money in the same way. Many people would love to bring, some rice that they have just harvested, or chickens that they have just raised, or those kind of things as an offering, which, let's face it, sounds even more biblical, doesn't it? And so again, we need to just take time to step back and allow and work alongside and ask questions to help local people give birth, not to churches that they have seen online, because they're going to replicate the Hillsong model themselves, and we're just going to be there patting them on the back, but to ask those probing questions of what would it really look like? What does it look like to make offerings in Cambodian culture, for example?
This is kind of an aside, but I'm remembering my grandmother and my mom also, of course, from my grandmother, even their kind of home garden, the first fruit, so to speak, again, biblical model here, they would give to the pastor just as that practice there. Yeah.
It's kind of what capitalism has done to our faith, isn't it?
The fifth model you have is teacher to guide.
Yeah. I think there are times when we need to teach some kinds of expertise, or we're bringing some technical approaches. Maybe we're training up surgeons or something like that. But what I'm talking about here is kind of the approach to how we seek transformation in a community. And I believe that God is very, very interested in what it's going to look like to see shalom come. But the problem is that we often think that we know what transformation will look like for people. And so as teachers and those with power, we often bring the status quo. We talk about, well, when this country's developed like the US, you'll have this, that, and the other. But that's not necessarily the kind of shalom and transformation that God is looking for. And so we run the danger when we come with answers of bringing the wrong answers. And so I think it's much wiser to act rather than as a teacher, as a guide. And it's probably pedagogically speaking, Paulo Freire speaks about this, which just in one of the most interesting books I've ever read, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about how teachers are bearers of the status quo, and they tend to download all the information in their heads into the heads of their students. And so there's no room for change. There's no room for challenging the status quo. What he advocates instead, and what I advocate in the book, is this questioning approach of what would it look like to see change here, and helping people to come up with the answers and the solutions for themselves. So let me give you an example.
Yeah.
During COVID, we were locked down in Cambodia, and it was a bit more, people talked about tyranny in the West. Let me tell you, you have no idea what tyranny looks like. We were given an hour's notice before the soldiers came and started rolling out barricades with razor wire on the end of each of our streets, so we could not get off our block. And then, it's one thing for me, I have a fridge with some food in it. What about my neighbors who, what they make each day is what they buy food that night. And so they were not able to work. People are starting to get really hungry. And so I jumped on a Zoom call with some of our Alongsiders leaders. Alongsiders is the youth discipleship movement that I'm a part of leading. And we basically said, we're on this Zoom and all these Cambodian leaders, and we're saying, what are we going to do? And the usual model is, okay, how do we get a lot of rice in trucks and deliver it to poor people and solve their problem? But that just simply wasn't going to be an option. And it's not really the Alongsiders ethos anyway. And one of them said, well, what if we were to share our food and encourage others to share their food? And so we came up with this kind of idea, and I think other people have done it around the world as well, but we basically were putting these tables out the front of our houses with a little sign in Cambodian language that said, those who have, please join us and add something to this table. But if you're in need, help yourself. It was much more pithy in Cambodian. And we made it a hashtag. And so we started doing this, putting these little tables out. And then we took some photos, put them on Facebook, hashtag, and tagged 3 of our friends and challenged them to do it. This was an idea that came from the Cambodian leaders themselves. And, as an outsider, my natural instinct is to reach for my network, the money I can raise. There's sometimes a place for that. But that would have robbed them of the chance to see this beautiful movement of sharing go viral all over Cambodia. It was beautiful. Not just Christians participating, but non-Christians as well, all over the country. It was very cool to see.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember, I'm kind of curious, like how long that lasted. I remember in the States, even in my neighborhood, there was a small kind of like sharing table, down one of my paths.
This was a flash in the pan. It was during the lockdowns. The lockdowns lasted about a month. And that's sometimes how the Spirit works. The Spirit blows through, and we appreciate the work of the Spirit. We recognize and see the work of the Spirit, and we thank God for that.
That's a good attitude. I think this, so much of what you're saying has its roots in, at least I would recognize, in what's called, for folks unfamiliar, asset-based community development. And, that kind of that mutual sharing rather than just you as an outsider, like coming in and raising tons of money or delivering rice in trucks. I've recently been really wrestling with how to implement this more community involvement in a nonprofit I'm working with. And you had this really intriguing example in the book of the feeding the 5,000 as asset-based community development. Talk more about that. I'm just so intrigued by that.
Yeah, I think it's it's just a wonderful example of that, where the disciples see this massive need, and their first kind of gut response is the one that we see all around the world today, which is paralysis or apathy. Jesus, send them home.
Right.
There's a problem.
Right.
Send them away. And so that's kind of us washing our hands of what's going on in the world. And so Jesus rejects that, of course. And so their next response is kind of the response of charity. And we've seen this for decades, the charity response. They say, should we go and spend half a year's wages to buy food from the next village, bring in outside resources, spend a lot of money, solve the problem for the people? Is basically the charity model.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a good place for critiquing that model as well. And Jesus also rejects it, interestingly enough. And so there you have we all know how this story unfolds, but this little boy, the one who's the most vulnerable, the most overlooked, and what he has to bring to the party is so pathetic.
Mm-hmm.
And we usually only have eyes to see the pathetic nature of what local people have to offer. We have eyes to see only deficit.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesus sees beyond that, and of course we know how it unfolds. And there's so much of a miracle that takes place because there's room for faith, because there's room to look to Jesus, and because those who are poor and downtrodden get to participate. And I think that's a beautiful example of asset-based community development.
Yeah, that is great. I love that. I love that perspective. One of the themes you've hinted at here, and certainly I wanted to talk about, is you talk about this in the context of quote unquote international mission work. I'm really intrigued, and I was really intrigued when I read this book about it in the context of kind of even in the States, here in the United States, of church planting effort or church planting movement. Because all these themes of apostle to catalyst, prophet ally, evangelist to seeker, pastor to midwife, teacher to guide, I think they can all be super relevant. So maybe, I don't know, the question, if you want to talk maybe to that. And I'm also curious, is there ever a time where, you want to retain those kind of roles of how do you know when you're an insider? Because I mean, to some extent, are we ever really insiders? I don't know if that makes sense.
Sure. I'm passionate about movements as well. And I lead a discipleship movement that has just exploded over the last few years, grown into 30 countries. And so these are some of the principles that we've discovered are the keys of local ownership, of local empowerment, of leaders rising up. Wherever there's no sense of ownership, there's just no sense of responsibility. How many of us wash a rental car when we return it? We wash our own car religiously because we own it. Rental car, who cares? Who cares?
Yeah.
And it's the same with ministry. It's the same with movements. And I actually believe that these principles are for any context where we're wanting to empower people and we're wanting people to have a sense of ownership. So whether you are a senior leader and wanting to see younger leaders rise up, this is a good framework for that. Or whether you are working in a place where you are actually culturally an outsider, even if it's in your own country, and you're wanting to see something led and taken forward by insiders, then that's also relevant. But I think this posture of humility, this posture of listening, this posture of serving and not coming in flag waving and triumphalistic, I think resonates with this generation.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it from your context, the Hillsong mentality, right? Certainly, I see it in my neck of the woods. I don't think there's a Hillsong Denver, so to speak, but there's other churches, I won't say their names, who come in with that same kind of here we are, here we have it. It's very intriguing. We don't have. I need to take a break here, and for sake of time, but let me ask you real quick before we do so. Talk just real quick about you have 5 dangers in the book. I feel like it'd be amiss to not at least touch on those.
Sure. So I want to lay out in this book kind of the 5-fold framework of the 5 missional types, but I also lay out 5 blind spots that we come, especially as Westerners working in cross-cultural contexts. And I'll just briefly list those off. We won't have time to get into them, but it's the blind spot around power and the power that we hold, that we're very not often aware of. There's the blind spot of complicity, and that's around, systemic issues. There's the blind spot of secularism. We might be actually surprised as Western Christians how secular we actually are, compared to Cambodians who, when they get sick, it's prayer, it's looking to God. And there's the blind spot of money. Because we are not poor, we often overlook how powerful money is in situations of poverty. And it takes a while to really get your head around how explosive money really is. And then finally, the blind spot of individualism. And so in the book, I unpack each of those. And it's really to give us, a renewing of our minds, because we are bringing so much cultural stuff into these cross-cultural situations.
Well, hopefully this leaves folks with just a little bit of a tease to go out and buy the book and read it for themselves. The book is Subversive Mission, Serving as Outsiders in a World of Need. And again, I want to recommend this. I think this has, for our listeners, practical implications, like Craig said, no matter the context you're working on, whether it's foreign, overseas, traditional type mission work, or even in a neighborhood, in a community as part of a church. Craig, let's take a quick break here and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Craig Greenfield, and Craig, really appreciate the conversation, really appreciate these perspectives here. These closing questions, I always tell folks you can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you're Pope for a day, what might that day look like for you?
Well, one of the things that I love about Jesus is that Jesus was the Prince of Peace, and we live in a world today that is absolutely still being torn apart by violence. And I live in a country that was, lost a third of its population to war. And so if I were Pope for a day, I think I would be trying to negotiate with governments around actions towards peace and nonviolence, rather than the billions and billions and trillions that are spent on the machinery of war. I would be looking at what can we do to love our enemies and seek peaceful resolution.
Yeah. All right, a theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Look, I'm a fan of Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement. I love how she spoke out against war, but also, and I love the way she frames her critique of the dirty, rotten system. I love that. But she came with a vision for communities that welcome people on the margins, and that's been an inspiration for me throughout my life.
Yeah, good. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Well, I actually spent a little bit of time in the West last year. I was in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And it feels like we are so disconnected from the rest of the world. We're in our cultural bubbles. We listen to news about our own countries, and there's a whole wide world out there. And we have the internet, but we seem to become even more and more cocooned. Right. And I think we'll look back and realize, wow, we were really disconnected from one another, and we lack perspective in many ways because of that.
Yeah, that has to be perhaps I don't know if the greatest irony of our time is that for how connected and like information and connection to all sorts of perspectives and news from across the globe is available instantaneously at our fingertips. Yet we're becoming more and more insulated and isolated.
Yeah.
Right. What are your hopes for the future of Christianity?
Look, I hope we'll rediscover Jesus, who came to proclaim good news to the poor. It's very interesting to me that both those on the right and on the left who have their things that they are passionate about. No one's talking about the poor. Even on the left, where traditionally they should supposed to be talking about the poor, they're actually talking about other things these days. And I hope that as Christians would rediscover this Jesus who said, "Blessed are the poor. I've come to bring good news to the poor. That's my mission here on this earth." And realize that, Jesus is with those who are on the margins.
Yeah. Where can people connect with you?
So I have a website, craiggreenfield.com, just my name, where I have a blog, and you can actually take a free missional types test on there and download a free PDF that describes all the 5 types. My organization, Alongsiders International, and working in 30 countries, a discipleship movement that's growing fast, is at alongsiders.org. And then I have a Facebook page as well. So those are probably the best places to connect in.
Great. And I assume the book available wherever books are sold?
That's right. Especially in North America. Not so much in Asia and Africa.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Amen. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.